afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this grant writing workshop on Selling Your Treatment Court program, hosted by the National Drug Court Resource Center. Our presenters today are Drs. Christina Lanier and Dr. Kristen DeVall, co-directors of the center and professors of sociology and criminology at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. My name is Savannah Bryson. I'm the project coordinator for the center. As a general reminder, all attendees will be muted during the presentation. Please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to submit comments to presenters or to presenters and attendees. Questions should be submitted to the Q&A box, and all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. A recording of this session will be available on the NDCRC website later this week. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to our policy advisor from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Greg Terrain.
All right, thank you, Savannah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's grant writing webinar. Again, my name is Gregory Terrain. I am the policy advisor at BJA, who oversees the drug court program. In 2020, BJA received $103 million or appropriations to support the drug court program. With that, 60% of that funding does support individual drug court programs. 40% of that supports juvenile and family drug courts, and also training technical assistance and other drug court research projects that work towards expanding the drug court field. In 2020, BJA made over 123 awards. With that funding, that was probably the largest amount of awards that we made since the BJA program started in 1995. With that said, BJA anticipates we're having an increase in funding for FY 2020, which makes this webinar really good to have at this time for FY 2020. One thing I'd like to say in terms of our partnerships, what really helped us to be successful at BJA has been working with the Center for Court Innovation, working with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, working with the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, as well as working with the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. I also like to give a big thanks to our big partners working with the state drug court coordinators. I like to always say when I get a chance to talk with them, they are our eyes and ears within the state, and they truly are big advocates for the work that you do within your states as it relates to drug courts. Again, thank you for participating in today's webinar, and I'd like to turn it back over to Kristen. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Greg. As Savannah mentioned, my name is Kristen DeVall, and I am one of the presenters today, as well as my colleague, Christina Lanier. So we thank you for joining us. We know these are challenging times, and so we appreciate your time and attentiveness. Please note that we are always willing to answer questions that you may have as you work toward developing a grant proposal for the next round of funding. So today's webinar is really designed to provide an overview for you as it relates to putting together the project narrative. So some of you may be experienced grant writers, some of you may be new to the field, and so we hope that this presentation really meets the needs of all of you. So we'll start with, we have a couple of questions that we would like folks to answer, and then we'll move on to our presentation of the project narrative. So the first question is just asking about your experience. And then the second question is asking about the most difficult section of a grant proposal from your perspective. So we'll give you about 20 seconds or so to answer these questions, if you'd be so kind.
Looks like we're getting there. Almost.
Yes.
Almost 100% participation.
Yes.
It is anonymous.
Great, I think we can end the poll.
Okay. Here we go, 5, 4.
All right, so it looks like about a third of you are brand new to the process of grant writing, and so that's great. We hope that this sparks some interest, but also gives you some tools that you can use when you're actually writing a grant. And then some of you have a little bit of experience, as well as some that are more experienced. With regard to the sections of the grant proposal that you find most difficult or challenging to write, it looks like a good cross section of many of the sections that we're going to be talking about today. So we hope that, again, this material is helpful to you all. So we'll start with kind of an overview of the components of, as we mentioned, the components of your project narrative. And so the abstract is actually not part of per se the project narrative, but directly related to the project narrative and the contents in there. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. Then we'll move on to the statement of the problem. So how do you craft that? Then we'll move to the project design and implementation section of the project narrative, then the capabilities and competencies, and then finally the evaluation, continued care, sustainability, and data collection section. So we like to think of these as really the abstract and then the 4 major components to your project narrative. Within the last section, there is a time task plan, or some of you may be familiar with it referred to as a project timeline. And so we'll talk about that as well. So before you get started, some helpful hints. So throughout this presentation, we'll be talking about not only the content within each section, but also providing you with some helpful hints that we believe may make the process a little bit easier. So the first kind of helpful hint would be to carefully read the proposal. And so when Christy and I write grants, we actually each read it through cover to cover, line by line, and also highlight important pieces of information. And then we come back together and talk about kind of what we read and how we interpreted that. 2 pieces of information to keep in mind as you're reading through here is who can apply. So who is eligible to be the applicant? Is that a particular program? Is that a county? Is it a state entity? So that will be at the very beginning of the request for proposal that you're reading. It will state who's eligible to apply. And then also, what are the grant funds able to support? So there are specific activities or items that grant funds can be used to support. There's also a section within the RFP that talks about activities or items that are not allowable under the current RFP. The second piece is going to be to determine the problem or the need to be addressed with funding. So this really warrants a conversation with as many stakeholders involved with your treatment court team as possible. So what is the problem that you're trying to address? And what do you need funding to support? Within this same conversation, you should be talking about, do you need to partner with any community entities? And if so, will you need a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement with those entities and community partners? Also, what evidence-based practices do you propose to include in your application for funding? And then finally, the third point before you get started, what elements of the program will be supported with these funds? So this may be personnel. Maybe you're proposing to hire new individuals. Maybe you want to expand the treatment options available to program participants. Maybe you want to support an external evaluation. So really identifying what elements of the program are you going to use or are you going to ask for funding? After you've done that, what Christy and I find helpful is to then create an outline of the RFP or the request for proposal, noting the documents that you need to include for submission. And so part of this outline, this really is designed to keep you organized and also lets you know items have been completed, but then also what do you still need to obtain from other folks. So supporting documents, there may be quite a few depending on how many community partners or how many agencies you're working with. And so you want to make sure that you have all of those in time for submission. The next piece is around paying attention to the dollar amount and the length of the grant period. So really keeping what it is that you're wanting to do manageable and feasible given the dollar amount and the length of the grant period. BJA grants kind of over the last several years have been 3-year funding periods, but you'll want to make sure by reading the RFP to determine the appropriate grant length. And then finally, a to-do list. So this is where you get to delegate and bring on your partners for writing the grant to create a task plan, and then also who's going to be responsible for those items. And so we'll share here on the next screen what an example to-do list may look like. This is not set in stone, but this is rather something that Christy and I use when we start the grant process. So you'll see in the top left corner, and we're happy to share this with you as an attachment if it's easier to read, but some really important information, things like the authorizing official for the applicant organization, the grants.gov username and password, as well as the organization, the applicant organization, DUNS number and EIN number. So this is really just a table of information that you definitely need before it comes time to upload your grant documents. The second are items to be noted in the RFP. So what are the objectives of the funding? You can write that out there in terms of from BJA's perspective, what are they looking to fund? And then also the ways to expand or improve your program. So again, really outlining what it is that you're proposing to do with this funding if you receive it. The next section just really breaks down all of the features of the application, from the program abstract to the project narrative to the budget and time task plan. So this is really designed to just be, what are the items that we need and who's going to be assigned to complete them. So we actually share this with anybody that's assisting us with writing the grant because we have made those allocations in terms of who's responsible for what. And all of this information can be found in the RFP. This is just kind of a one-pager that folks can look at to see what it is that they need and go from there. So the first main section is that of the abstract. And for those of you that have ever read an academic article, you're familiar with an abstract. And so this is really a summary. And so what we've done for each section of the grant proposal is provided you with some helpful hints, but then we'll also show you what it looks like in the RFP. So you get kind of a visual representation of that. So the abstract really is designed to provide an overview of the project, as well as answer some specific information requested by BJA. So all of the abstract elements will be outlined for you in the RFP by BJA. It's really important to note there is a word limit for the abstract. And so the method that Christy and I have used is we write and then we go back and cut if we need to, right? So we change words, or we, maybe we're too wordy in a particular area, so we trim it down. But the idea is get the information in there. You can always go back at it later on, but do pay attention to the word limit. This document is typically written last. And while it might seem like the easiest document to write, it really does synthesize information from all of the different sections in your program narrative. So this is typically written last because a lot of those decisions that you're going to make, you might not have up front. And so just kind of keep that in mind. And then also note, there may be a PDF template available for the abstract. So this is uploaded as a separate document, not in the project narrative. And so if you want to use that template, you can, or you can just attach it as a Word file. So the next screen shows you exactly what this abstract looks like within the RFP. And so you can see there's a whole host of information written there in terms of the items that you need to answer and include in your abstract. And so some helpful hints here. One would be to answer the bullet points in the order that they appear. All right. And so it'll ask you for, what category of funding are you applying in? If there's multiple categories within that RFP, state that. What's the dollar amount? How many participants are going to be served with this funding? So there are some really specific pieces of information that need to be included there. Just make sure that you include those. The second tip is to ensure that the information that's in the abstract matches what is in your program narrative. So again, if you write this too soon and decisions are made, later on, you might forget to go back and update that abstract. So just make sure that things like the total budget amount that you're asking for, as well as the number of participants to be served, maybe the specific best practices that you're going to be addressing. You want to make sure that your abstract is consistent with that project narrative document. And then, as I mentioned, you're going to be uploading this as a separate attachment. So this does not count against your project narrative page limit. Okay. So our best piece of advice here is to just make sure you're answering the bullet points. So now we're moving into the project narrative. And so again, this is really kind of the first section, is the statement of the problem. And this is probably one, being an academic, the one that I enjoy the most, is really kind of setting the stage for why is funding needed, right? So what is the problem that you're trying to address through this application for funding from BJA? And so here, the project narrative document as a whole, so all 4 of these sections that we're going to be talking about, there is a page limit, typically 20 pages, but again, read through that RFP because it could change in terms of the page length. Okay. But in the statement of the problem, it's really important that you answer specifically the questions or the bullet points that they're asking. Okay. And so answer those in the order that they appear. The second piece is you want to be clear, concise, and convincing. So think about that as you're writing this statement of the problem. You want to be clear, convincing, and concise. So what are the challenges to be addressed? How do you want to improve the program? Maybe where has your program, not performed up to the standard that you'd like? And what are the potential benefits to be realized? So how through this funding, that's going to support these changes that you're going to make, what is it that's going to result from that? All right. So really being convincing in your request for funding and why this is important for your program. Use data to support your position. And so again, you're creating this problem statement. And so using substance use data, local arrest data, census data. So you really want the reader, and the reader in this case is going to be making a decision about whether or not the application is funded or not funded. You want them to be convinced, and you want to provide them with data that's supporting your position. And so the degree to which you can get data that is specific to your jurisdiction or the jurisdiction that your program is serving, even better. Again, to make that case and make that case convincing. And so we would like to draw your attention to some resources that we have at the National Drug Court Resource Center on our website, both literature and some data that you can use to craft your statement of the problem. So we have a whole host of resources on various best practices, as well as different types of treatment. And so we would call your attention to visiting that website as you're thinking about what might you want to do, and is there a literature base to support what it is that we're doing? And you could certainly use that in this problem statement of the problem. The next section is around, so here is an example of what that statement of the problem looks like in the RFP. And so what we've done here is in the last round of funding, so fiscal year 2019, veterans treatment courts could apply, as well as adult drug treatment courts and statewide applications. So as you're reading through each section, there was the sort of the generic language around the statement of the problem, but then specific questions or specific items that you needed to address in your statement of the problem based on what category you were applying under. So if you were a veterans treatment court applying for implementation funds, you were in category 1 and you had 3 bullet points that you needed to address in that statement of the problem. On the other hand, if you were an adult drug court applicant applying for funding, you had a series of 4 or 5 bullet points that you needed to address in your statement of the problem. So it's really important that you look at and again, make sure that you're answering the questions that correspond with the correct category. You'll also see here highlighted is the reference to providing specific data to support your statement of the problem. So again, how many people, but also what does your jurisdiction look like? So in terms of some tips for the statement of the problem, again, one would be to justify your position with data. The second is to cite your data sources. So again, if you're using census data to describe your community's population, definitely cite that. If you're using local arrest records, you want to be sure to cite that as well. So cite the data source where you're getting that information. Another strength of statement of the problem sections is that you can use program evaluation data when possible. So if your program is currently being evaluated, you could use evaluation information to describe how your program is to be enhanced or expanded. And so again, utilize that as another data source for supporting your statement of the problem and making that convincing. And then also, this is probably one that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, I think, but is really important, is sure that the data you're citing connects to the statement of the problem. And so you want to make sure that, again, you're telling this compelling story and that people want to then learn more in the next section about how you're going to address that problem through your project design and implementation. So it's really, if you think about it, it's really about telling a story. You're describing the problem that you've identified and then what you're going to do about it in that next section. And so an example of that was around a program that Christy and I actually evaluate. And through some program evaluation data, it became clear that several of the participants in the program over the past year had children, but did not have custody of their children. And in talking about what that meant for the program and, was the program actually meeting that need, the program staff discovered and sort of came to the conclusion that they really wanted to be able to offer parenting classes for those participants because they had children and they didn't have custody of those children. So we wrote a grant using those data and using sort of that story for a grant to support being able to facilitate parenting classes. So again, that's just one example of how you can use data to make the case for what it is that you're proposing. All right, so I'd turn it over to my co-facilitator, Christina Lanier, to talk about the project design and implementation.
Thanks, Kristen. So far you've talked about the abstract and selling that project, selling what you're going to do. And so now the important piece is, how are you going to do it? And so the program design and implementation section of the RFP is where you're going to demonstrate that your program, your project can be put into action and how it will be put into action. And so just a few points that we make when we're talking about program design and implementation. You want to make sure that you link what your project to the RFP goals and the mission of the funding agency. Now, this may seem logical, but you really want to go back, read that RFP. What are the goals? Is the goal of the RFP to increase community safety? Is the goal of the RFP to increase policing relationships? So whatever you're working towards, whatever goal that agency has, you want to write your program design and implementation so that it links to those goals. You'll see in the RFP, I believe it's in the abstract, it even starts in the abstract, that they ask you to link and to identify the best practice standards that you're going to be addressing with the project and the 10 key components. So you want to ensure that all of the project design, all of the elements of your project are going to be in line with the best practice standards and the 10 key components. It's very important that you follow the mission of the funding agency. They're not going to fund you if your project is out in left field as far as what they're interested in spending the money on. So very important. Clearly describe what you are proposing. So what you're proposing to do, be very clear about it. And again, this should link to that problem statement that you just wrote about, okay? So what are you proposing to do? Making sure that the program, that the problem statement and then your project design align with each other. You want to make sure that those align with each other. So you've made this wonderful case for why your project should be funded, the need in your community or the need in your jurisdiction, and then tell us how you're going to do that. How are you going to execute to meet that need or to solve that problem? Making sure those two things are clearly connected. Now, one other thing to think about is you really want it to be, as we usually talk to people about, is realistic, logical, and feasible. People who review grant proposals, regardless of the funding agency, generally have an idea of what they're looking for. And they're looking for something that is able to actually occur. So if you say you're going to serve 500 people, but in the past 3 years, the most that you have served in 1 year is 50, and you're going to have to share that data, then you're probably going to have some questions around, is that realistic? Is that feasible? Can you actually serve 500 people or 500 participants? Okay, so being sure that those goals, what you say you're going to do is realistic and can actually happen. Now, similar to what Kristen showed you with the abstract and the program design, the program problem statement, I'm going to show you directly out of the RFP what that looks like. This may be a little tough to see, but again, what the point for showing it to you is just so you can see that there's different requirements and going back to reading that RFP very clearly and very closely. So as Kristen referenced before, there's various categories. So when it comes to the project design and implementation, you'll notice that the project design and implementation has the same top 5 bullets, regardless of the category that you're in. I'm going to say that again. So in this particular iteration, let us make that clear. This is just last year's iteration, okay? It can change every year, but for example's sake, so in last year's iteration, every applicant, regardless of the category, needed to answer those bullet points and then go down and answer the questions or the bullet points for your particular category. Okay. And some of those tend to look the same. So don't think, oh, well, VTC looks just like ADC, so I'll just go do that one. Be sure to follow the one that you're applying for so that you make sure that you hit those bullet points that are being asked. Okay. So the program design and implementation, as you can see here, just to give you a couple of examples. So demonstrate that the drug court will, discuss the applicant's commitment to admit and provide evidence-based interventions to participants. So there's no need to get fancy with your writing here. Just answer the bullet point. What evidence-based interventions or evidence-based practices are going to be provided? And what are the strategies for getting early assessment? Okay. So just answering those bullet points as they appear, which, as you can see, is a trend in our tips. Answer the bullet points in order that they appear. We're going to say this in every section because we don't want to jump around. Keep in mind that grants, you write a whole lot more grants than you actually get funded. And I can tell you that we have learned from our mistakes in the early days of grant writing of maybe not doing this exactly how answering the bullets in the order that they appear. In full disclosure, we maybe got a little too fancy with our writing and tried to integrate bullet points together. Not necessary, okay? Answer the bullet points in the order that they appear. And I can tell you that once we started really focusing on that a few years ago and really focused on answering, I would say that our success rate did go up when it comes to grant writing, for sure. One of the things that we do, and again, because this presentation is about practicality and our practical experience with writing grants, and we've written a number of grants and garnered over $2 million in funding across all of the grants that we have written for other entities such as treatment courts and criminal justice programs. These are just the things that we do. Doesn't mean you have to do them. But one of the things that we always like to do is, because the best practice standards and the 10 key components are so important in these applications, and being able to demonstrate that your court, your program, your project is aligning with those best practice standards and those 10 key components, we will often bold when we're addressing one of those components or best practice standards. So again, this is a literally, we will bold the text to say, associated with best practice standard 2. Relatedly, if you go back to the abstract, you'll see that in the abstract, one of the requirements is that you put the page numbers that the best practice standards appear in your document. And so it also makes it easier to go find those and find the page numbers because you've already bolded them. So when you go write that abstract, the last thing that you're going to write, you can easily go find the page numbers that are associated with the best practice standards because you've already bolded them. So again, more of just a practical, something we do technique, again, not required. One of the things that is very important in funding or in grant writing is, and you've heard this term, I'm sure, many a times, is evidence-based practices. And the term evidence-based practices can get thrown around a little bit more than probably is necessary, but we want to discuss and justify the use of these evidence-based practices. And how do we do that? We do that with research and we do that with literature. You probably have heard evidence-based practices. So there's particular types of interventions that are considered to be evidence-based. Some of the most popular ones that you probably have heard of, MRT, CBT, there's many others. But one of the things that you need to do is you need to justify or explain that that particular evidence-based practice is appropriate for your target population. So this is the justify piece, okay? So has that particular evidence-based practice been used with the population that you intend to serve? Has it been demonstrated that it's effective with the population that you're going to serve? So you don't want to, I always say my academic term, you don't want to just willy-nilly go pick something, some sort of treatment that looks good on the shelf. You want to make sure that that evidence-based practice has been utilized with the population that you intend to work with. Okay. So the next section of the project narrative or program narrative is what's referred to as the capabilities and competencies. And the capabilities and competencies is where you are selling your team. You are selling the people who are going to work on this team. And so it is demonstrating the skills and expertise related to the project or the program. And this is really important because, again, the reviewers are going to be looking to see, well, do you have someone in position that can do X, Y, and Z? Now, you may not have them, you may not have that person hired yet, or maybe perhaps it's somebody that you're going to hire in the future, but do you have an idea of what those requirements will be for that individual? Do you know what you're looking for? Okay. So oftentimes when you do capabilities and competencies, you want to talk about the credentials of your team members. So who is your program coordinator, your project coordinator, your case managers, who is your district attorney representative, your defense attorney representative on your team. One of the things that tends to stand out when it comes to capabilities and competencies with these types of grant proposals is your relationship, not surprisingly, with treatment. Do you have a treatment partnership? Do you have somebody in place or more than one entity in place to provide that treatment, which we know is the hallmark of drug treatment court programs? It's in the name. So treatment partnerships. And then also, what's the history of that relationship with that treatment program? The credentials of the treatment program itself will also need to be included. So what kind of history does the treatment agency have? Do they have a good, solid reputation within the community or the jurisdiction? And then you also want to talk about training of team members when you're talking about credentials. So do you do continuous education training? Do you do national training with your team members? Do you do NADCP's tune-up trainings or implementation trainings, send people to virtual conferences? So you want to include those types of things because being able to demonstrate that, again, capabilities and competencies of your team is really important when we're talking about getting people or funding projects and making sure that they can actually happen. Because remember, that's the point, right? They want to make sure that if they're going to fund you, that you can actually do what you said you were going to do. Can you put that into action? And these are just the pieces, this is one of the pieces that you need. It's important when you're writing this section, and you'll see this in just a second, I'll show you again the example from the RFP, is really detailing the roles and responsibilities of everyone. Now, I'm going to say as a side, you may have to get a little creative with how you present that information because there is a page limit. We've used different ways to do that. Sometimes if it's allowable, we'll use a table. We'll use bullet points sometimes, but again, it's just really depending on the page limit and sort of what the format needs to look like. But making sure that the roles and responsibilities of everyone. One thing that you may have noticed is that we don't have anything in this presentation about the budget or the budget narrative, basically because that's like a whole nother ball of wax, okay? We're talking about money, fiscal responsibility, how do we make sure that we're doing or using the money how we're supposed to? But I do want to bring it up briefly because when we're talking about the roles and responsibilities, the individuals who are going to get quote unquote paid as part of this grant will be listed in the budget narrative. Those individuals that are listed in the budget narrative and in the budget need to be listed here as well. So the roles and responsibilities need to, or the individuals that you're talking about, roles and responsibilities, need to align with that budget. So who's getting the money or who's getting paid or who's being funded, but then you need to have who they are in here, okay, and what's their responsibility. And make sure that's very, very clear. Some grants have a planning period, and sometimes you only need somebody half-time or half of the year. So you want to make sure to really spell that out in this section. And then very important, MOUs or MOAs, who do you need? You'll notice that one of the requirements, of course, is an MOU of all treatment court team members. Well, do you need MOUs beyond that? Do you know, is there something else that you need? Do you need those partners in the community partners? You need some, something else to get started. And it's really important, again, lesson learned, right? To start this really early in the process. People are busy in getting signatures and making sure that everyone's on the same page. You all probably are very aware it takes time. And so we want to make sure that when we go back to that to-do list and we've sketched out what we need, as soon as we know what we need, as soon as we are aware that we need to reach out to X agency to get an MOU or find out their process for an MOU, or maybe a letter of support. Sometimes you just need a letter of support from various agencies. You've got to start that early, okay? So make sure that you start that early. The capabilities and competencies, what that looks like in the RFP. Again, we have one set for, we're just showing you category 1 and category 3. Again, example. But here you can see some of the verbiage is the same, but you want to be sure that you're looking at your category. What do you need to include for your category? Okay, so you can see here they ask about, well, you might not be able to see it, I'm not sure. You can talk about training. You want to talk about training, identify each member of the drug court team, describe their roles and responsibilities. Key team members must be included. Describe how effective communication and coordination among the team members will be implemented throughout the program period. Wow, how do we answer that, right? So we probably don't just want to say we're going to email each other. We might want to go into a little bit more detail about exactly how that communication process is going to take. But you can see these are the bullet points. These are the things that you need to answer when it comes to capabilities and competencies. Demonstrating that your team, that your project has the people power to actually do what they've said they're going to do. That's so, that's really, really important to demonstrate that, because capacity is very important. Tips, I bet you can guess the first one. Answer the bullet points in the order that they are presented. Yes, that again, we just sort of showed you that. And then just really for this section, pay attention to the needed attachments. Sometimes you need job descriptions for all key personnel. Sometimes you need resumes, those MOUs that I already mentioned. It depends on what you need. There in all RFPs, there's going to be a whole section that's called additional attachments. Okay. Those additional attachments can trick people or slip them up. Really make sure that you pay attention to those and make sure that you have all of the additional attachments that you need, and make sure you're submitting them properly. My goodness, we don't really even have time to get into the logistics of submitting the actual grant, but you want to make sure some grants, things have to be named a certain way. Certain attachments need to be in one document altogether, one large PDF document. Okay, these are really important details that you have to pay attention to. And you might think to yourself, well, my goodness, I wouldn't think just not having an attachment in the right place would, have me not get funded. Well, not that I can say that for sure, but it demonstrates the ability just to follow directions and making sure that you're reading the details of the RFP. So think about that, okay? Now, the last section that we're going to talk about, again, because the budget narrative would be a separate discussion altogether, is what's called the Evaluation, Continued Care, Sustainability, and Data Collection Plan, or we like to call it the kitchen sink. So this is the section where you're going to demonstrate that, number one, you can collect data data, that you can provide aftercare and that your program will continue once the funding is finished. Okay. This section usually requires you to review the required performance measures. Now, if you've ever had funding before, you know what I'm talking about, the performance measurement tools. These are very important. Most RFPs are going to have those listed, or a lot of times now they're going to an electronic link that will take you to the performance measures that are required for that particular grant. It's very important that you review these because you want to make sure that you're going to be able to collect that data. Do you have access to that information? Because as you begin to set up your data collection plan and your process for collecting that data, you have a lot of questions that you need to answer. And I can tell you that this evaluation and data collection plan for some reviewers and some funding agencies will play a large role in the funding of a project. Things to think about. Who is going to be responsible for collecting these data? You know what you need. Now, who is going to be the one that collects it? Is your case manager going to collect it? Is this going to be something that's done at intake, 30 days, post 30 days into the program, 60 days into the program, post program, all of these things, you should have these data points, these data collection points laid out. Where are you going to do that? When are you going to do these? Where will it be stored or maintained? A lot of entities have state data collection systems. Some don't have state data collections or online MIS management information systems. It's okay if you don't have that, because an Excel spreadsheet will work wonders for you to be able to store and maintain this data. Okay, it's very important that you collect data in a consistent and often manner, because you don't want to get behind on data. Oh, please don't get behind on data. Kristen and I do a lot of evaluation. That's our thing. And once you get behind on data, it is almost next to impossible to catch up. So think about how you can use an Excel spreadsheet if you don't have a database. You can also, there's other systems you can use. Some people use, I think it's PowerPoint or Access, Microsoft Access. Some people use that as well. When will the data be collected? I mentioned that just a minute ago, because who's responsible relates to when it will be collected. Is treatment collecting data? Is treatment providing you with data? If treatment's providing you with data, when do you get those data from treatment? And again, where is it going to go? Where is it going to go? We are big advocates of pen and paper for some things, and then putting it into perhaps the Excel spreadsheet, but having that paper copy of things is yeah, something that's, for us, can't go wrong if you have it on paper. And then how often will the data be reviewed or analyzed? So most grants, you have quarterly reports, quarterly PMT reports. And so you don't want to wait until, those are due April 30th for the first quarter. I would suggest we don't wait until April 29th to start looking at that data. So we want to have a plan in place. Okay, April 1st, the first day after the quarter, we want to start looking at that data to collapse it. I mean, be looking at it as you go along, but for that report, to put it all together. Okay, so how often will the data be reviewed and analyzed? Kristen referenced this at the beginning of the talk, the time task plan, or sometimes called a timeline. And this is a separate attachment most often, but it's usually referenced to some degree in this section. Again, it could be referenced in other sections, but it usually is as part of the questions or the bullet points in this section. And the time task plan really lays out exactly that, the timeline. What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? Who's going to be responsible for it? So there's a number of ways to display this information. And we even have more than one way that we do it. So we're just going to show you again. I'm going to keep saying this is our example, not anything that's required, but this is how we use the time task plan. And please forgive me from the beginning, because I do believe this one might be very difficult to see. But again, we wanted to just be able to show it to you. So you can see here what we do is we separate everything out by year, then we separate everything out by quarter. Our goals for the program are associated with activities, and then we just fill in the blanks. Okay. When is this going to happen? When is it going to be available? The one on the left, which is the time task plan that we've used in the past, the gray shaded boxes are actually part of the time. So these activities are going to take place during this time. So you can see maybe that in beginning the grant period in Q1, that one is shaded in gray because that's when it begins. It's not shaded the rest of the time because the grant period only begins once, one time. Okay. So when are these services going to be offered? The one on the right is a little bit different in that it details out the beginning of the grant period, when is this expected to be completed, and who's responsible for that particular task, party or parties. Okay. So lots of different ways to do this, the task time plan. Continuing with this section, because it has more of it, evaluation, continued care, sustainability, and data collection. The two other components that should be talked about is this continued care. And so describe how the program will specifically address the issue of continued care for participants. What an important issue, especially when it comes to drug treatment courts. And what they're generally talking about here is aftercare plans. What are you going to do for those participants when they're finished with the program? Again, I think this could be a presentation of its own, but just briefly to say, we know that aftercare and research around aftercare is very limited. We need to do more to understand how we can implement aftercare programs or plans for our target population. So for this particular RFP, you need to describe how are you going to do that. Right? Alumni groups, extended treatment, extended care. We actually wrote a grant and it got funded for literally having treatment for people who were finished with the program, very structured treatment program or treatment plan, and ancillary services. So it was that was what the funding was actually for. Okay. And then sustainability. This sometimes is a tough one. How are you going to sustain after the grant period ends? This is one that you should be thinking about from the very beginning. As soon as you read that RFP and decide what you want to have funded, what kind of collaborations do you need? What kind of evaluations do you need? Who do you need to talk to? City, county, foundations, where can you get that information? Okay. It's so important that we have sustainability after the grant period ends. Just to show you, again, an example of this section. So this is section 4. You can see that for both of these sections, here is the same. So applicant must describe your ability to analyze client level demographic performance, outcome, regular assessments. And so that really relates to the PMT and those performance measures. So again, the same across the board. And then we separate that out by category 1 for veterans and category 3 for adult drug court applicants. Okay. So really, really thinking about those efforts to keep this going after the data collection period. So real quickly, some tips. We're doing great on time. Some tips. Oh, there it is again. Sorry. Answer the bullet points as they are presented. That's our motto for today. Really specify the data collection plan and process. This is the foundation of your evaluation. Yes, there's a page limit. And yes, you have to be cognizant of that, but don't leave out the details of your data collection plan or data collection process just because of page numbers. Figure someplace else to get that cut out. If you have multiple entities providing data to you, it better be very, very clear how that data is being given or how it is being received by, let's say, the treatment court program. Where is it coming from? Okay. Ensure that the data you need is available before the funding is received. Go look at those performance measures. Probably not too much of a problem given that the performance measures really revolve around what treatment courts could collect, but you want to be sure. You want to make sure that you can get that data. And if you can't, then obviously you need to come up with a way to get it so that you can apply for the grant. Right at the top, you'll see one of the requirements is just to clearly state that you can and will collect the required performance measure data. And it will say in the RFP that you're not required to present any data in this section, but you are required to state or to demonstrate that you have the capacity to collect that performance measurement data. So whatever that data looks like, you have the ability to collect that data. When it comes to sustainability, we just sort of put it out there. You just, no fluff. No fluff with regard to sustainability. You need to be specific, really specific. As I said before, this can be a tough section, but if you start from the beginning, thinking about how can we keep going if this funding ends, and if is the question, then you're going to have a nice plan in place, and it's not going to be tough. It's not going to be hard by the time you get, kind of get to that section because you've already thought about it. And then relatedly, you just don't make promises that can't be kept when it comes to the sustainability piece. Okay. If you know that the county budget is short for next year, don't say we're probably going to get double the amount of funding from the county. I mean, that would be like awesome, but you're probably not going to get it. So you want to just be really careful when you're doing that. So these sections of the project or the program narrative are really the meat of your proposal. And again, the budget and budget narrative are another piece, and that's important as well. But this is where you're going to sell your program, is in this area. Kristen?
Great, thanks. So one thing also to keep in mind, as Christy mentioned, each one of these sections has a specific focus and specific elements that you need to address. But also pay attention to, in the RFP, each section is weighted and it will be given a percentage for how much weight each section has. So just pay attention to that as you're writing. Typically, the project design and implementation section has the highest weight associated with that. And obviously you can probably see for good reason, that's really where you're outlining what it is that you're going to do in order to address that problem statement in section 1. And then in section 3, with the capabilities and competencies, why is our team really positioned well in terms of credentials and partnerships that we have in place to address that and to put that project and plan into place. And then finally, with the 4th section, how are we going to collect data about our project that we've implemented? How are we going to report that? And how are we going to sustain that beyond the project period? So really thinking about how those 4 sections fit together and how they do really, if you think about it, tell a comprehensive story about what it is that you're proposing to do. So just think about that, and hopefully maybe the storytelling frame of mind may help you put that all together. And so keep that in mind, as well as the weights that are associated with each section. So just some summary points that we'd like to end with. There are places where there is repetition within the RFP. So routinely, you may see and read a bullet point that you said, I thought I already answered this, or didn't we address that in the last section? Yes, that is the case, but still answer it in that section. So again, think about that as part of this bigger picture. So there are places, just answer it. Also start early and outline necessary steps for putting the application materials together. Typically, and again, this is just sort of on average, when RFPs are released, it's typically about 6, 7, 8 weeks before the deadline for submitting those application materials. So that's a decent length of time, but you want to make sure that you're getting started early and that you can kind of work backwards from that due date, because those due dates are hard and fast. And so when they say, you know, an application is due on June 30, for example, it is due on June 30 by that due date. And so it's really important to, again, kind of to plan and be really organized. The third, not surprisingly, answer all the bullet points. Again, we can't stress that enough, but all of those pieces, again, paint that larger picture that they want to see. And then finally, using data and research to support what it is that you're proposing for funding. And again, tying that back to that statement of the problem that you articulated in the first section. So again, thinking about it in terms of that storytelling. Another tool that may be really helpful, so the to-do list that we showed you in the task plan are things that we have designed, and we're happy to share those with you. But we also want to call your attention to the application checklist that is at the end of every RFP. So this also gives you some things to sort of mark off. And if you find that helpful, you can utilize that, or you can create your own. But just know that that is there as a resource, highlighting what it is that you need. Also, in addition to not only starting early and putting together your project narrative and those attachments, keep in mind the length of time it may take to get signatures from other entities, other folks that may need to sign on. So things like MOUs, MOAs, letters of support. Agencies may have their own internal processes for making those available. And so you want to give yourself as much time as possible to make sure that those are attached. And then finally, just staying organized. So having, a repository for the files that you're creating, what it is that you're needing, the data and the literature that you're utilizing to support your position, that is really half the battle. And so we hope that, this overview of, again, how to put together your project narrative is helpful. We do want to mention the fact that as of right now, BJA has not released the fiscal year 20 grant applications. But we thought this webinar would be timely in that it would give you something to think about and maybe give you, a couple of months of lead time to work with your team to identify maybe, what it is that you might want to propose in terms of funding and what areas within your program you might want to focus. So we wanted to provide you with enough time, but I do want to let you know the grant RFPs from BJA typically come out in the spring. And so if you're looking frantically for those online now, they're not there, but you could certainly look at, and what we referenced in the presentation today was last year's RFP. So you get an idea of the types of information that they're requesting and the type of data that you would need in order to gather to be prepared to write your proposal in the spring of 2021. So we would welcome any questions or comments, thoughts.
Yeah. Looks like Savannah might have some questions.
We sure do. Thank you guys so much. I know that was a lot of information in an hour, but it was a lot of good information. We have a few just general questions about the application process and writing the proposal as a whole, and then some more specific ones. So the first question is, do we answer bullet points in bullet point format or narrative?
I would answer it in narrative format. But just making sure that you address each of the bullet points. Sometimes if there's a list that needs to be created or something, list these things, then at times we'll make a bulleted list just to save space, but I would definitely write it as a narrative versus a bullet point. Good question though.
Perfect, thank you. Is there a step-by-step document which outlines the process of grant development and writing, including things like what meetings to schedule with which stakeholders, etc.?
We don't have one created, but maybe we could.
And I was like, well, that actually sounds like something that we could use.
Not that I'm aware of, but certainly I think it would be program dependent in terms of what it is that you're asking for and who would all need to be at the table. So that would be definitely something to start on, earlier to invite those folks to the table to maybe talk about what you're thinking. And then once the RFP is released, you could, then work to make that happen.
Cool.
That's a good question.
All right, next question. Is there a general list of what is needed for grant applications as far as data to be collected? An overview or something for a specialty court that would include things like race, sex, jail population, and other mental health or offense information. And if not, if we were to start a spreadsheet, what data should be collected?
That's good. Good questions. We don't have one offhand that's specific for grants, but as far as what should be collected, those things that you mentioned previously, such as demographic characteristics, things like participant treatment, urine screens, all of those sorts of things. We could share that document, Kristen, the data collection document, data collection sheet. We have a data collection sheet that we've used in the past with programs that we could share that, and that would be a good starting point for what to put in a document. So let me write that down.
Perfect. Some more questions, more regarding data collection. Do you recommend endnotes to cite data sources when you're writing the RFP?
So for us, it really comes down to a space issue. And if we need that end of the if we use endnotes, but we really need that space at the end of the 20 pages, you can attach as a separate attachment a references sheet. And so I would say it's really a space, if you can include it by answering all the bullet points and your references in your project narrative, that's fine. But if you do need that space at the end, I would move your endnotes to a separate references page.
Perfect. Okay, and then are you concerned about using data that may be as old as a decade?
I think off the top of my head, I would say yes, given sort of the changing everything. I'm not sure what type of data. It would really depend on the type of data that you're referring to. I don't know if you're still on, but maybe you can expand upon maybe the type of data that you're referencing. Because that would be helpful for us.
Okay, maybe we can come back to that one.
Okay.
Okay, some grant related questions. Will BJA notify you if you did not receive the grant? We applied earlier this year and haven't heard anything. Just wondering if you didn't get the funding, will they let you know, and will there be any feedback?
Yes, we typically notify you if you either receive an award or you don't receive an award. And we also, if you don't receive an award, we'll send out something indicating the reasons why your award may not have been awarded or your application might not have received an award. So that does typically go out.
Well, thank you, Greg. Also, is there a negative perception by grant funders when you do not request the maximum amount available?
No, it's again, when you read the solicitation, it's up to $500,000 and it's up to 36 months. So it's based off what is your need. So we've at times received grant applications that indicated $50,000. So it's not looked upon negatively.
Thank you. We might need a little more elaboration on this one. Regarding the weight of each section, most people spend time on statement of need and it may not be worth as many points. I don't know what the question is. So if that was your question, if you feel the need to elaborate, please do so and we can come back to that. Another question, is it necessary to have an independent evaluator for performance measure outcomes?
No, I mean, programs have done that internally, just gathering the information that is required on the performance measurement data. So these are specific questions and specific measures that, you report quarterly. So that could be done internally. You just need to specify who is going to be responsible for collecting and reporting those data in that fourth section.
If awarded a BJA grant, do you come out and do a site visit?
So this is Greg. So what happens when you receive an award, normally we work with our TTA provider, NADCP, who comes out and does initial assessment of your drug court. And what that assessment does is just to look to see where you're currently operating as a drug court program consistent with the 10 key components as well as NADC best practices. And from that, provide you with recommendations to support you. So the initial visit is to see how where you're currently operating and seeing how we can best support you using our federal funds to be a more successful drug court program. But yeah, every new drug court does receive a either right now virtual site visit.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Can applying for too many grants in one fiscal year impact your chances of getting any of them?
No, you can apply for as many, you can submit as many applications. Just remember that when you're submitting different applications, they have to be of a different focus. You can't submit 3 different applications requesting the same enhancement services, targeting the same community. But no, that wouldn't hurt you submitting a number of applications, no.
Are the BJA requirements similar to SAMHSA with no cost extensions, carryovers, biannual reports, and closeout summary?
Yes.
Okay. If you utilize surveys for your participants, should you obtain an IRB review? Christy's nodding.
Yeah.
We would suggest that you do an IRB whenever you're having human subjects research. There are times when human subjects research, what you think is human subjects research, is not. So the types of questions that you're asking, that's what determines whether or not it's human subjects research. But our rule of thumb for Kristen and I, no matter what we're doing, we get IRB approval. Now, it may be, again, it depends on maybe your entity, your state, your county, and what that looks like. As academics, we definitely always get IRB approval. And then there are some other entities that can provide you with IRB approval. So you would want to look into kind of where you're at and how that functions within your jurisdiction.
Christy, for those of us that are new to the process, can you just briefly explain what IRB is and why?
So IRB is the Institutional Review Board. So all universities and other research entities have an IRB board. well, that's kind of saying board twice, have an IRB. And so the responsibility of the IRB is to ensure that no harm is done to participants and to ensure that the ethics of the project are upheld and are within the confines of human subjects research.
Cool. Thank you. We had one other question that came up during the evaluation, sustainability, and data collection portion. Do you like logic models?
We love
Yes.
yeah. Yes.
That can be a great tool to use to engage your team around what specific aspects of your program for example, do you want to enhance? Because that is outlined in such a way that you would list the activities. Okay, so maybe what enhancement activities, do you want to include? And then, what change or what outcomes are going to result from that, and how does that feed into and align with the spirit and the goal of your program? So yes, logic models can be a great way to structure the conversation. And be very systematic about what it is that you are proposing to do and the change that you hope to see in your participants and in the program. So huge fan of logic models. Yes.
Very good.
Definitely.
We have another question come in. Just as a reminder, if you think of anything, go ahead and throw it in the Q&A and we'll hit it before we wrap up. This one is, I'm new to my position. I'm overwhelmed with where to even begin looking for grants, which is totally understandable, especially ones that make sense for my program. Do you have a suggestion for where to begin?
I would say a great place to begin, and that's totally understandable. The grant world can be overwhelming. So you're not alone. We've all been there. I would say probably checking out last year's round of RFPs would be a great place to start. And so, you might start with BJA and looking at the RFP that was put out, and just reading through that to see, what is it that is asked for in terms of, the questions, and, what kind of work, might you want to have supported by BJA funds. And so, again, we would be happy to talk with you about, kind of what would make sense for your program. But I would say, look at the most recent round of solicitations from BJA. SAMHSA is another funder of treatment court programs. And so, what type of treatment court program you have may help sort of guide what agency, but BJA covers, a whole host of types of treatment courts.
Yeah, I also want to reference also OJJDP, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. They also fund juvenile treatment drug courts as well as family treatment drug courts.
And a good place to kind of just start looking at examples and some things from last year is on the grants page of the NDCRC website. So we have some example program narratives. We have some external resources for putting together these applications. And then we also still have the webinar up from the fiscal year 2020 application or open solicitation from last year. So you'll be able to see Greg's presentation, the webinar that kind of walked us through that solicitation, and to give you an idea of what's coming forward next year. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or the chat. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so this will be available on the NDCRC YouTube channel as well as on our website, hopefully as early as later this week. You should have received a copy of the PowerPoint presentation in an email. If you registered after the email went out, you may not have gotten it, so definitely shoot us an email at ndcrc@uncw.edu and we'll make sure you get a copy of that. We can also send out, I know some of the print was small on the slides, but we can send out some of the attachments that were used, and then also be on the lookout for an evaluation email. It'll take less than 2 minutes, but it would very much help us out so we can make sure that we can do better for you next time. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you, everybody,
for
for coming.
joining
We
us.
appreciate it. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen
thanks,
and
guys.
Christy.
Thank you.
Appreciate y'all being here with us.
Thank you.